The phone call came on a Tuesday morning while I was reviewing quarterly reports for my investment portfolio. Jessica's voice carried that familiar tone she used when delivering news she knew I wouldn't like, wrapped in false sweetness that fooled no one. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Dad, about Thanksgiving this year, she began, and I already knew where this was heading. Brad and I have been talking, and we really want to keep it small and intimate, just our immediate family, you know? We need some space to create our own traditions with Emma and Tyler. I set down my coffee cup with deliberate care, watching the steam curl upward like my patience dissolving into the morning air. 23 years of hosting Thanksgiving at Pinewood Country Club because it was Jessica's favorite venue. 23 years of footing the bill for elaborate dinners that grew larger each year as she invited more of Brad's extended family. 23 years of being the reliable grandfather who made the magic happen while getting less appreciation each passing holiday. I understand, I replied calmly, though something cold and determined was crystallizing in my chest. You want space. I'll give you all the space you need. Thanks for understanding, Dad. I knew you'd be reasonable about this. The relief in her voice was unmistakable, followed immediately by the familiar pivot. Oh, and could you possibly help us with the catering costs? We're planning something really special at home this year, and with Brad's promotion still pending, money's a bit tight. There it was, the contradiction that defined our relationship. Don't come, but please pay for the privilege of being excluded. I hung up after agreeing to wire the money, then sat in my study, looking out at the Connecticut landscape turning gold and crimson with autumn's arrival. At 68, I'd spent the last decade watching my daughter transform from the sweet girl who used to help me carve turkeys into someone who saw me primarily as a funding source for her lifestyle. The memories flooded back as I sat there, each one a small cut that had accumulated into something deeper over the years. Jessica's wedding 12 years ago, where I'd paid for everything from the flowers to the honeymoon, while Brad's family contributed a toast and their presents. The down payment on their house in Norwalk, $65,000 that I'd provided without question when Jessica claimed they'd found their dream home. The repeated emergency loans when Brad's various business ventures failed to materialize into the success they'd promised. Emma and Tyler's private school tuition, their summer camps, their sports equipment, their college funds that I'd been steadily filling while Jessica complained about her own financial stress. Not once in the past 5 years had Jessica called simply to check on my well-being. Not once had she invited me to their home for a casual dinner or asked about my life beyond what I could provide for theirs. Every conversation began with pleasantries that lasted exactly long enough to establish that I was in a good mood and financially stable, then pivoted to whatever they needed from me. I walked through my empty house in Stamford, the silence amplifying the realization that had been building for months. This wasn't a family relationship. This was a business arrangement where I provided capital and services in exchange for limited access to my grandchildren and the occasional acknowledgement of my existence during major holidays. The dynamic had become so normalized that I'd stopped questioning it, simply accepting that this was what modern family relationships looked like. But sitting in my study that Tuesday morning, something fundamental shifted. The hurt I'd been carrying transformed into something sharper and more purposeful. I'd built a successful construction company from nothing, sold it for more money than Jessica could imagine, and invested those proceeds wisely enough to be worth more at 68 than I'd ever dreamed possible.
I owned properties throughout New England, had a portfolio that generated more monthly income than most people earned in a year, and commanded respect in business circles throughout Connecticut. Yet to my own daughter, I was nothing more than a convenient ATM with a heartbeat. I reached for my phone and dialed a number I hadn't called in several weeks. Harold Patterson answered on the second ring, his voice carrying the warmth that came from 40 years of genuine friendship. "Frank, this is a surprise. How are you holding up in that big empty house?" Harold was one of the few people who truly understood my situation. He'd watched Jessica's transformation over the years with growing dismay, though he'd been too polite to voice his concerns directly. His own children treated him with the respect and affection that I remembered receiving from Jessica when she was younger, before marriage and motherhood had somehow convinced her that her father was primarily valuable for his financial contributions. I need to ask you something, and I want you to be completely honest with me." I kept my voice steady, professional. "What do you really think about how Jessica treats me?" The silence stretched for several moments. When Harold spoke again, his voice carried careful consideration. "Frank, you're asking me to say something I've wanted to discuss with you for years, but didn't know how to bring up without overstepping. Consider this permission to overstep. She treats you like a bank, Frank. Has for years, and watching it happen has been painful for Dorothy and me, because we remember the girl she used to be. But somewhere along the way, she started seeing you as a resource instead of a person. The fact that you're even asking me this question suggests you already know the answer." Harold's words hit me like physical blows, not because they were unexpected, but because hearing them voiced by someone else made them undeniably real. I'd been enabling this dynamic for so long that I'd lost sight of how abnormal it had become. "She just disinvited me from Thanksgiving," I said quietly. "Wants to keep it intimate and create new traditions. Then asked me to pay for the catering." "Jesus, Frank." Harold's voice carried genuine anger. "That's unconscionable. Even for her, that's beyond the pale." "I'm going to change things, Hal. I'm tired of being taken for granted." "What are you thinking?" I looked out my window at the autumn afternoon, watching leaves spiral down from the old maple tree I'd planted the year Jessica was born. That tree had grown strong and beautiful over the decades, its roots deep and its branches reaching toward the sky. Somehow, in raising my daughter, I'd forgotten to teach her the difference between taking and receiving, between entitlement and gratitude. I'm thinking it's time Jessica learned what it means to lose something she's taken for granted. After ending the call with Harold, I sat in my study considering options. The obvious choice was to simply stop providing financial support and let Jessica figure out her own way forward. But that approach felt passive, reactive. I'd spent too many years being reactive to her demands. What I needed was something more definitive, something that would demonstrate the reality of our relationship in terms she couldn't ignore or rationalize away. That's when the idea began forming. Jessica had chosen Pinewood Country Club as the venue for every major family celebration for over 2 decades. She loved the elegance of the dining rooms, the prestige of hosting events there, the way it impressed her friends and Brad's business contacts. She'd never asked whether I minded paying premium prices for a venue that was more about her image than family togetherness. She'd simply assumed that Pinewood was available whenever she wanted it, paid for by her father's seemingly endless resources. I'd been a member at Pinewood for 15 years, had served on various committees, and maintained friendly relationships with the ownership group. More importantly, I'd been hearing rumors for months that the club was struggling financially.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The pandemic had hurt their membership numbers, and several major corporate sponsors had reduced their commitments. The owners were supposedly looking for an investor or buyer who could inject capital while maintaining the club's reputation and standards. I reached for my phone again and dialed James Morrison, no relation despite the shared surname, who served as Pinewood's general manager. We'd worked together on several charity events over the years, and I knew he respected both my business acumen and my commitment to the club's community. "Frank, how you doing? Getting ready for the holiday season?" "Actually, Jim, that's partly why I'm calling. I've been hearing some interesting rumors about Pinewood's financial situation, and I wanted to discuss a potential business opportunity." The conversation that followed lasted nearly an hour. Jim confirmed what I'd suspected about the club's financial challenges and admitted that the ownership group had been quietly exploring their options. By the end of our discussion, we'd scheduled a meeting for Thursday morning with the club's board of directors and primary investors. The next 48 hours passed in a blur of financial due diligence, legal consultations, and strategic planning. My accountant reviewed Pinewood's books and confirmed that the club was fundamentally sound but cash poor, exactly the kind of investment opportunity I'd built my wealth recognizing. My lawyer examined the existing ownership structure and identified a clear path toward acquisition that would allow me to maintain the club's operations while implementing necessary improvements. By Thursday afternoon, I'd made an offer that the board found impossible to refuse. 51% ownership of Pinewood Country Club, with an immediate capital injection sufficient to modernize their facilities, expand their catering operations, and secure their financial future for the next decade. The deal included my assumption of the club's existing debts and commitments, plus a management structure that would preserve jobs while improving service quality. The paperwork would take several weeks to finalize, but James Morrison assured me that my ownership stake would be effective immediately. More importantly, for my purposes, he confirmed that all existing reservations and bookings would be honored under the new ownership structure, including the Thanksgiving dinner that Jessica had booked for her intimate family gathering. I spent Friday morning walking through Pinewood's facilities with new eyes. The main dining room, where Jessica planned to host her exclusive celebration, overlooked the club's pristine golf course and private lake. The kitchen facilities were professional grade, capable of preparing elaborate meals for hundreds of guests. The wine cellar contained bottles worth more than most people's cars, curated by sommeliers who understood the relationship between great food and exceptional beverages. This was my club now. My dining rooms, my kitchen, my staff, my decision about who got to use the facilities and under what circumstances. Jessica had spent 23 years assuming that Pinewood would always be available for her celebrations, paid for by her father's generosity and managed according to her preferences. She'd never considered the possibility that her access to this lifestyle might be contingent on maintaining a respectful relationship with the person who made it possible. The irony wasn't lost on me. In trying to exclude me from Thanksgiving, Jessica had inadvertently created the perfect opportunity for me to demonstrate just how much of her comfortable lifestyle depended on my resources and connections. She wanted independence from her father's influence. She was about to discover exactly what that independence looked like. Saturday morning brought a phone call from Dorothy Williams, Harold's wife and one of my oldest friends in Connecticut. Dorothy had never been one to sugarcoat her opinions, and over the years, she'd become increasingly vocal about Jessica's treatment of me.
"Harold told me about Thanksgiving," she said without preamble. "I've been stewing about it all night, and I need to say something." "Go ahead, Dot. I value your honesty." "That girl has lost her mind if she thinks she can treat you like hired help. You've given her everything, supported every whim, and enabled every poor decision she and that husband of hers have made for over a decade. And this is how she repays you? By disinviting you from the holiday you've been paying for since she was old enough to have opinions about turkey preparation?" Dorothy's anger was fierce and protective, the kind that came from watching someone you care about being mistreated by people who should know better. "I'm not going to let this slide, Dot. I've made some changes that Jessica doesn't know about yet." "What kind of changes?" I explained about purchasing Pinewood, about becoming the new owner of the venue where Jessica planned to host her intimate family gathering. Dorothy's laughter was immediate and delighted.
Frank Morrison, you magnificent bastard. She's going to walk into her own father's establishment and try to exclude him from dinner? That's exactly what's going to happen. Can I be there when you reveal the surprise? Please. I'll behave myself, I promise. The idea of having witnesses to Jessica's reaction was appealing. Part of me wanted this to be a private confrontation between father and daughter, a moment of reckoning that might lead to honest conversation about our relationship. But another part of me recognized that Jessica had never responded well to private discussions about her behavior. She was skilled at deflecting criticism, rationalizing her choices, and making me feel guilty for questioning her decisions. A public revelation, witnessed by people whose opinions she valued, might be the only way to cut through her defenses and force her to confront the reality of how she'd been treating me. Actually, Dot, I think that's a perfect idea. Would you and Hal like to join me for Thanksgiving dinner at Pinewood? As my guests, of course. We'd be honored, Frank, and I promise to contain my schadenfreude to appropriately dignified levels. By Sunday, I had extended invitations to 6 of my closest friends, Harold and Dorothy Patterson, Jim and Carol Martinez from my investment club, Ruth Thompson, my former colleague who'd retired from teaching but maintained her sharp wit and clearer perspective on family dynamics. Each of them had watched Jessica's behavior over the years with growing concern, and each of them had expressed frustration at her treatment of me. These weren't people looking for drama or entertainment. They were friends who genuinely cared about my well-being and had grown tired of watching me be taken advantage of by my own daughter. Their presence at Thanksgiving would provide both moral support for me and social pressure for Jessica to behave civilly, assuming she was capable of recognizing the situation for what it was. I spent Monday morning at Pinewood, meeting with the catering staff and reviewing the arrangements for Thursday's dinner service. The head chef, a woman named Maria Santos, who'd worked at the club for over 8 years, was excited about the ownership change and eager to discuss improvements to their holiday menu offerings. Mr. Morrison, I have to tell you, it's refreshing to work with an owner who understands food service. The previous ownership group was more focused on profit margins than quality, and it showed in our customer satisfaction scores. Maria walked me through the kitchen facilities, pointing out equipment that needed upgrading and systems that could be streamlined. Her passion for her work was obvious, and her ideas for improving Pinewood's culinary reputation were both creative and practical. "What can you tell me about Thursday's Thanksgiving reservations?" I asked as we reviewed the dining room assignments. "We have 3 private parties booked, plus regular dining room service. The Morrison Chen party requested our most exclusive dining room, the one overlooking the lake. They've been very specific about privacy and service timing." Jessica had indeed chosen the most expensive and prestigious option available, assuming that her father would absorb the costs without question, while she enjoyed the benefits without his presence. "I'll be dining here on Thursday as well, Maria, with a party of 7 in the main dining room. I'd like to make sure we receive exemplary service." "Of course, Mr. Morrison. As the new owner, you'll receive our absolute best attention." The new owner. The words carried weight that Jessica couldn't possibly imagine. She'd spent her adult life taking my resources for granted, assuming that venues like Pinewood would always be available whenever she decided she needed them. She'd never considered that her access to these privileges was entirely dependent on her relationship with me. Thursday was going to be educational for both of us. Tuesday morning arrived with the kind of crisp November air that made Connecticut autumns legendary. I stood in my study reviewing the final ownership documents that my lawyer had delivered the night before. Everything was official now. The signatures were dry. The money had been transferred, and Pinewood Country Club belonged to me in every legal sense that mattered. The transformation wasn't just financial, it was psychological. For the first time in years, I felt the satisfaction that came from making decisions based on my own values rather than accommodating someone else's expectations. The club's staff had embraced the ownership change with enthusiasm that surprised me, Maria Santos had already submitted proposals for menu improvements that would elevate Pinewood's reputation throughout Fairfield County. The groundskeeping crew was excited about facility upgrades that would enhance the golf course and gardens. Even the administrative staff seemed energized by having an owner who understood hospitality from the ground up. Harold Patterson arrived at 10 o'clock sharp for our scheduled meeting with James Morrison about Thanksgiving logistics. Harold had insisted on reviewing the arrangements personally, claiming he wanted to ensure everything proceeded smoothly for what he'd started calling Frank's Independence Day. His military background made him naturally suited for tactical planning, and his protective instincts regarding my well-being had kicked into full gear once he understood what Jessica had done. "Status report," Harold said as he settled into my study's leather chair. "How are you holding up mentally? Any second thoughts about this approach?" I appreciated Harold's directness. He'd known me long enough to recognize when I was operating from emotion versus logic, and he wasn't the type to enable poor decision-making regardless of our friendship. "I'm clearer about this than I've been about anything in years, Hal. This isn't revenge or spite. This is boundary setting with someone who's proven incapable of respecting boundaries unless they're enforced." "And if she genuinely apologizes? If she recognizes what she's done and asks for forgiveness?" The question forced me to examine my own motivations more carefully. Part of me hoped that Thursday's revelation would shock Jessica into recognizing how her behavior had affected our relationship, but another part of me acknowledged that genuine change would require more than just embarrassment or surprise. If she apologizes sincerely and demonstrates real understanding of what she's put me through, then we'll have a foundation to rebuild from, I said after considering Harold's question. But if she responds with anger, defensiveness, or more manipulation, then I'll know our relationship has deteriorated beyond repair. Harold nodded approvingly. "That's the right approach. Give her the opportunity to do the right thing, but don't enable her to continue the wrong thing." We drove to Pinewood together, taking the scenic route through Greenwich that showcased some of Connecticut's most beautiful residential areas. Harold had always appreciated architecture and landscaping, and our conversation drifted naturally toward the improvements I planned for the club's grounds and facilities.
"You know what's interesting about this whole situation?" Harold mused as we passed a particularly stunning colonial estate. "Jessica thinks she's asserting independence by excluding you from Thanksgiving, but she's actually demonstrating how dependent she's become on your resources. She can't even imagine hosting a holiday celebration without your financial backing." The observation was astute and painful. Jessica's request for catering money revealed the fundamental contradiction in her position. She wanted emotional distance, but financial proximity. She wanted to create new traditions, but expected me to fund them. She wanted independence, but only the kind that came with subsidies. At Pinewood, James Morrison greeted us with obvious pride in the club's transformation. Even in the few days since the ownership change became official, there was a different energy in the staff's interactions. People seemed more confident, more engaged with their work. "Frank, I have to tell you, the response to your ownership has been overwhelmingly positive," James said as we toured the dining rooms. "Members are excited about the improvements you're planning, and the staff feels more secure about their positions here." We reviewed Thursday's arrangements in detail. Jessica's party would be seated in the Lakeview dining room at 2 o'clock with a specially designed menu featuring traditional Thanksgiving dishes prepared with premium ingredients. My party would arrive at 3:30 and be seated in the main dining room with clear sight lines to the Lakeview room, but enough distance to maintain initial privacy. Maria Santos joined us to discuss the timing of food service. Her excitement about cooking for the new owner was touching, and her suggestions for wine pairings demonstrated both professional expertise and personal investment in creating a memorable experience. "Mr. Morrison, I've been working on some special touches for your Thanksgiving dinner," Maria said, consulting her notes. "Given the significance of this meal, I want everything to be perfect." The significance of this meal. She understood intuitively that Thursday represented more than just a holiday dinner. This was a statement about dignity, respect, and the consequences of taking people for granted. Harold and I spent another hour walking through the club's facilities, discussing long-term improvements and immediate preparations. The wine cellar particularly impressed him, both for its selection and its investment potential. We selected several bottles for Thursday's dinner, including a 1998 Bordeaux that I had been saving for a special occasion. "This definitely qualifies as special," Harold said, examining the bottle's label. "The day Frank Morrison stopped being taken for granted deserves exceptional wine." Wednesday brought a flurry of last-minute preparations and unexpected developments. Dorothy Williams called early in the morning with news that she'd encountered Brad Chan at the Norwalk grocery store the night before. "Frank, you need to hear this," Dorothy said, her voice tight with indignation. "Brad was buying supplies for tomorrow's dinner, and he started complaining about the cost. Apparently, Jessica has been telling people that her father is being unreasonable about money, that you've become miserly in your old age." The accusation stung, not because it was true, but because it revealed how thoroughly Jessica had rationalized our situation. Rather than acknowledging her own behavior, she'd created a narrative where I was the problem. Her friends and social circle were hearing stories about a stingy father who'd suddenly become difficult about providing support. What exactly did Brad say? He told the checkout clerk that his father-in-law used to be generous but has recently become obsessed with money. Said you've been questioning every expense and making them feel guilty for asking for help. According to Brad, you've changed since retirement and don't understand how expensive it is to raise children in today's economy. The distortion was breathtaking.
Jessica and Brad had transformed my reasonable expectation of gratitude and respect into evidence of my declining generosity. They'd rewritten our history to position themselves as victims of my newfound selfishness rather than beneficiaries of decades of unconditional support. "There's more, Frank. Brad also mentioned that they're planning to have a serious conversation with you about your attitude after the holidays. Apparently, Jessica thinks you need professional help dealing with aging and retirement adjustment issues." The presumption was staggering. After excluding me from Thanksgiving and accepting my money to pay for their celebration, Jessica planned to confront me about my mental health because I'd finally started expecting basic respect in return for my support. Did you say anything to Brad? I bit my tongue until it bled, but I managed to keep quiet. However, I may have accidentally knocked over his shopping cart while he was loading groceries into his car. Dorothy's protective instincts were legendary among our social circle, and her barely contained rage on my behalf was both touching and concerning. The last thing I wanted was for Thursday's revelation to escalate into a broader conflict involving all of our friends and family connections. I need you to promise me something. Tomorrow is going to be emotional enough without additional drama. Let me handle Jessica and Brad. Your job is to be supportive without being confrontational. I'll behave myself, Frank, but only because you've asked me to. That girl needs to hear some hard truths about how she's been treating you. Wednesday afternoon brought the final confirmation I needed that my approach was justified. Jessica called at 3 o'clock with another request that perfectly encapsulated our dysfunctional dynamic. "Dad, I hate to ask, but could you possibly help with wine for tomorrow? We found some bottles we really wanted to serve, but they're more expensive than we budgeted for." The audacity was remarkable. After disinviting me from dinner, she was asking me to upgrade their wine selection. The request wasn't presented as an invitation to reconsider my exclusion or an acknowledgement of the awkwardness of the situation. It was simply another financial demand delivered with the expectation of compliance. "How much are we talking about, Jessica?" "Only about $300. I know it sounds like a lot, but Brad found this amazing wine shop in Westport, and the sommelier recommended some bottles that would be perfect for our menu." $300 for wine to accompany a dinner I wasn't invited to attend. The symbolic weight of the request was almost too perfect to believe. Jessica wanted me to fund the alcohol that would help her celebrate excluding me from our family tradition.
"I'll take care of it," I said, keeping my voice neutral. "Thank you so much, Dad. I really appreciate how understanding you're being about everything." Understanding. The word choice revealed everything about Jessica's perception of our situation. She saw my compliance as understanding, rather than recognizing the fundamental unfairness of her position. In her mind, I was being reasonable by accepting exclusion and generous by continuing to fund the celebration despite not being welcome to attend. After ending the call, I sat in my study considering the full scope of what had transpired over the past week. Jessica had disinvited me from Thanksgiving, asked me to pay for the catering, requested money for upgraded wine, and characterized my cooperation as evidence of my understanding nature. Meanwhile, she was telling mutual acquaintances that I'd become difficult and miserly, requiring intervention to address my problematic attitude about money. The contradiction was so extreme that it bordered on delusional. Jessica had created a reality where she was simultaneously entitled to my financial support and justified in excluding me from family celebrations. She'd convinced herself that my decades of generosity obligated me to continue providing resources regardless of how she treated me personally.
Thursday morning dawned clear and cold, with the kind of brilliant sunshine that made everything look sharp and defined. I dressed carefully in a navy suit that projected authority without arrogance, confidence without ostentation. This wasn't a costume for a performance. It was the appropriate attire for a successful businessman dining at his own establishment. My friends began arriving at Pinewood at 3:15. Each of them carrying themselves with the dignity that came from genuine relationships built on mutual respect and affection. Harold and Dorothy Patterson arrived first, followed by Jim and Carol Martinez. Then Ruth Thompson in her signature burgundy dress that made her silver hair look regal. These were people who had supported my success over the years without expecting financial rewards in return. They celebrated my achievements because they genuinely cared about my happiness, not because they calculated what my prosperity might mean for their own bank accounts. The contrast with Jessica's approach to our relationship couldn't have been more stark. James Morrison greeted our party personally, his professional warmth tinged with the satisfaction that came from serving someone he respected. The staff's attention to detail was impeccable, from the perfectly arranged table settings to the precisely timed service that would allow us to dine comfortably while maintaining awareness of activities in the Lakeview room. As we settled into our seats, I could see Jessica's party through the main dining room's elegant archway. She was holding court at a table for 6, animated and clearly pleased with her surroundings. Brad sat beside her, occasionally nodding along with her conversation, but mostly focused on his meal. Emma and Tyler, my grandchildren, seemed well-behaved but restrained, as if they'd been given specific instructions about proper behavior in an upscale restaurant. The sight of my grandchildren stirred emotions I'd been trying to suppress all week. Emma was 8 now, old enough to understand family dynamics, even if she couldn't articulate her confusion about why Grandpa Frank wasn't joining them for Thanksgiving. Tyler, at 6, probably just accepted the adult arrangements without questioning them, trusting that the grown-ups had made reasonable decisions. How many more holidays would pass before Emma and Tyler began to wonder why their grandfather was absent from family celebrations? How long before they internalized the message that older family members were expendable once they'd fulfilled their financial obligations? Jessica was teaching them lessons about loyalty, gratitude, and respect that would shape their own relationships for decades to come. The tragedy wasn't just what Jessica was doing to me, it was what she was teaching my grandchildren about how families treat each other when inconvenience or social preference conflict with obligation and love. Ruth Thompson noticed the direction of my gaze and placed her hand gently on my arm. "They're beautiful children, Frank. Don't let this situation make you forget that you're a wonderful grandfather who deserves to be part of their lives." The reminder was both comforting and painful. Whatever happened in the next hour would affect not just my relationship with Jessica, but my connection to Emma and Tyler. The stakes were higher than personal vindication or boundary setting.
This was about the kind of family legacy I wanted to leave behind. The moment came sooner than I expected. At 4:15, while we were enjoying Maria's exceptional butternut squash soup, I noticed Jessica rising from her table and walking purposefully toward the main dining room. Her expression carried the familiar mixture of determination and annoyance that appeared whenever she encountered something that didn't align with her expectations. She spotted me immediately, her steps faltering for just a moment before she resumed her approach with increased intensity.
The entire progression played out in slow motion, her confusion transforming into recognition, then into something approaching outrage as she processed the sight of her father dining comfortably in the very establishment where she'd expected to celebrate without him. "Dad?" Jessica's voice carried across the dining room with enough volume to attract attention from nearby tables. "What are you doing here?" I set down my soup spoon with deliberate care and looked up at my daughter. At 35, Jessica still possessed the striking features that had made her popular throughout high school and college, but years of entitlement had hardened her expressions in ways that makeup couldn't completely conceal. "Hello, Jessica. I'm having Thanksgiving dinner with my friends." "But this is Pinewood. This is where we're having our celebration." The statement revealed the depth of her assumptions about controlling shared spaces and experiences. In Jessica's mind, her reservation at Pinewood somehow created exclusive rights to the entire establishment, as if my presence violated the terms of her careful social planning. Harold Patterson rose from his seat with the courtly manners that had served him well in both military service and business negotiations. "Jessica, how lovely to see you. You look beautiful today." Harold's politeness forced Jessica to acknowledge the rest of our table, her gaze sweeping across faces she recognized from years of family gatherings and social events. Dorothy Williams offered a cool nod. Jim and Carol Martinez smiled with the kind of restraint that suggested they were withholding judgment but prepared for drama. Ruth Thompson maintained the serene expression she'd perfected during decades of managing difficult students and demanding parents. "I don't understand," Jessica said, directing her confusion back toward me. "You said you understood about us wanting space for our family celebration." "I do understand. That's exactly why I'm dining over here with people who actually wanted to spend Thanksgiving with me." The words landed with surgical precision. Jessica's face flushed as she processed the implication that her father had successfully organized alternative social arrangements that didn't depend on her inclusion or approval. "That's not what I meant, and you know it." "Help me understand what you did mean, then." "You said you wanted a small, intimate celebration with just your immediate family. I respected that decision and made other plans." Brad Chen appeared at Jessica's shoulder, his expression caught between embarrassment and confusion. Brad had never been comfortable with confrontation, preferring to let Jessica handle difficult conversations while he focused on avoiding conflict whenever possible. "Hey, Frank, didn't expect to see you here today." Brad's attempt at casual friendliness felt forced and awkward. "Hello, Brad. I hope you're enjoying your meal." Dorothy Williams couldn't resist inserting herself into the conversation with characteristic directness. "Jessica, dear, this is quite a coincidence. What are the odds that you choose the same restaurant as your father for Thanksgiving dinner?" The question was crafted to highlight the awkwardness of the situation while maintaining plausible innocence. Dorothy's talent for strategic conversation had been honed during decades of managing social dynamics in Connecticut's competitive suburban landscape. "We've been coming to Pinewood for years," Jessica replied defensively. This has always been our place for special celebrations. Your place? Ruth Thompson's voice carried the gentle authority she'd used to correct student misconceptions. I was under the impression that Pinewood was a club with multiple members and public dining facilities. Jessica's flush deepened as she realized her territorial claim sounded absurd when articulated in front of witnesses. The Lakeview dining room was elegant and expensive, but it wasn't a private residence that she could control or exclude people from accessing. I meant it's where our family traditionally celebrates holidays. Which family would that be? Harold asked, with deceptive mildness. Because Frank here is definitely part of your family, and he wasn't invited to your traditional celebration. The observation cut through Jessica's defensive rationalizations with uncomfortable clarity. She'd attempted to redefine family to exclude the person who'd made their lifestyle possible, while simultaneously claiming ownership of traditions that existed primarily because of his financial support. We explained that we wanted something smaller this year, more intimate. More intimate than including your father? Carol Martinez spoke for the first time, her voice carrying the bewilderment of someone trying to understand incomprehensible social logic. Jessica looked around the table, seeing her position becoming increasingly indefensible under the scrutiny of people whose opinions carried weight in their shared social circles. These weren't strangers she could dismiss or manipulate. These were established members of the community who'd known our family for years and witnessed our dynamics firsthand. This is a private family matter, Jessica said, attempting to regain control of the conversation, which you've made public by confronting your father in a restaurant dining room, Jim Martinez observed dryly. The accuracy of the statement seemed to penetrate Jessica's defensive fog for a moment. She glanced around the main dining room, noticing for the first time that other diners were watching our interaction with obvious interest. Her social instincts, usually reliable in managing her public image, finally kicked in as she realized the scene she was creating. "Dad, can we talk privately?" I considered the request while studying my daughter's face. The anger was still there, but it was competing with confusion and the first hints of uncertainty. Jessica was beginning to recognize that the situation wasn't developing according to her expectations. Of course. Would you prefer to step outside? Actually, could we use one of the private meeting rooms? I think this conversation requires some privacy. The request revealed Jessica's unconscious acknowledgement that she was no longer in her familiar territory of emotional manipulation and guilt-based persuasion. Whatever she planned to say would require isolation from the witnesses who'd been holding her accountable for her public statements. I excused myself from my friends and followed Jessica toward Pinewood's business facilities. The club maintained several small conference rooms for members who needed to conduct private meetings or conversations. As we walked, I noticed Jessica's increasing agitation, her confidence eroding as she struggled to process a situation that didn't fit her usual patterns of family control. The conference room Jessica selected overlooked the club's golf course, its windows framing the autumn landscape with postcard perfection. She closed the door firmly and turned to face me with an expression that mixed accusation with bewilderment. "What game are you playing here, Dad?" The question revealed her fundamental misunderstanding of what was happening. In Jessica's mind, my presence at Pinewood represented some kind of strategic manipulation designed to embarrass or control her, rather than the natural consequence of her own choices about family inclusion. "I'm not playing any games, Jessica. I'm having Thanksgiving dinner with friends who value my company." "But you knew we'd be here. You planned this to make me look bad in front of Brad and the kids." The accusation was both revealing and frustrating. Jessica's immediate assumption that my actions were primarily motivated by desire to harm her demonstrated how thoroughly she'd lost sight of my independent existence and needs. "Jessica, did it ever occur to you that my life doesn't revolve around your social calendar?
that I might have made plans based on my own preferences rather than calculations about how they'd affect you. She stared at me as if I'd spoken in a foreign language. The concept that I might organize my holiday celebration without considering her reactions seemed genuinely foreign to her understanding of family dynamics. "But this is our restaurant, Dad. This is where we always come for special occasions."
"No, Jessica. This is where I've taken you for special occasions because I could afford to and wanted to make you happy. There's a significant difference between those two things." The distinction seemed to penetrate her defensive assumptions for the first time. Jessica's mouth opened and closed several times as she processed the implications of what I'd said. "Are you saying you don't want to pay for our celebrations anymore?" The question crystallized everything wrong with our relationship into a single moment of clarity. After being excluded from Thanksgiving dinner, after being asked to fund the catering for a celebration I wasn't welcome to attend, after years of being treated like a financial resource rather than a beloved family member, Jessica's primary concern was whether I intended to continue subsidizing her lifestyle choices. I'm saying I want to be treated like a person rather than a bank account. I want conversations that aren't primarily about what you need from me. I want relationships based on mutual affection and respect rather than financial dependency. "That's not fair, Dad. You know I love you. When was the last time you called just to see how I was doing? When was the last time you invited me to your house for dinner? When did you last show interest in my life that didn't involve what I could provide for yours?" The questions hung in the air between us like accusations, each one highlighting the one-sided nature of our interactions over the past several years. Jessica's face cycled through emotions as she struggled to find answers that would support her position. "That's different. You're my father. It's your job to support me." The response revealed the fundamental delusion that had poisoned our relationship. Jessica had convinced herself that my parental love obligated me to provide unlimited financial support regardless of how she treated me personally. She'd transformed the voluntary nature of my generosity into an entitlement that existed independently of our emotional connection. "Jessica, I'll always love you because you're my daughter, but love doesn't mean enabling disrespectful behavior or accepting being taken for granted indefinitely." Her eyes filled with tears that seemed designed more for effect than genuine emotion. Jessica had learned years ago that displays of vulnerability could often deflect criticism and restore her access to resources when direct demands failed. "I can't believe you're doing this to me on Thanksgiving, Dad. This is supposed to be about family and gratitude." The irony was so complete that I almost smiled. Jessica was lecturing me about gratitude while standing in a restaurant where she'd planned to exclude me from our family celebration, but still expected me to pay the bills. A soft knock interrupted our increasingly tense conversation. James Morrison peered through the conference room's glass door, his expression carefully neutral, but his presence clearly intentional. "Excuse me, Mr. Morrison," James said, addressing me directly. "I apologize for the interruption, but there's a matter regarding your dining arrangements that requires your attention." Jessica looked between James and me with growing confusion. "Mr. Morrison? Why is he calling him that?" The moment had arrived sooner than I had anticipated, but perhaps that was for the best. The longer our private conversation continued, the more entrenched Jessica became in her defensive positions. Sometimes, truth needed to arrive with the force of revelation rather than the slow burn of explanation. "James, please come in. I'd like you to meet my daughter, Jessica Chen. Jessica, this is James Morrison, Pinewood's general manager." James entered the room with the professional composure that had made him invaluable during the club's transition. "Mrs. Chen, it's a pleasure to meet you. I hope you've been enjoying your Thanksgiving dinner in our Lakeview dining room." "Yes, it's been lovely," Jessica replied automatically, her social conditioning overriding her confusion. "The service has been exceptional. I'm delighted to hear that." We've been working very hard to maintain Pinewood's reputation for excellence, especially since the ownership change. Jessica's eyes sharpened with sudden interest. "Ownership change?" "Yes, we recently welcomed a new majority owner who's made significant investments in upgrading our facilities and expanding our services. I think you'll find the improvements quite impressive over the coming months. I watched Jessica processing this information, her mind racing to understand why the club's business arrangements were being discussed during what she'd assumed was a private family conversation. "That's interesting," Jessica said carefully. "Who is the new owner?" James Morrison smiled with genuine warmth as he looked directly at me. "You're looking at him, Mrs. Chen. Your father is Pinewood Country Club's new majority owner." The silence that followed was absolute. Jessica's face went through a progression of emotions so rapid and complex that she seemed to age several years in the span of seconds. Confusion gave way to disbelief, then to a dawning understanding that reconfigured everything she thought she knew about our current situation. "That's impossible," Jessica whispered. "I can show you the paperwork if you'd like," I said quietly. The purchase was finalized Monday morning. Jessica sank into one of the conference room chairs as if her legs could no longer support her. "You bought Pinewood? The entire club?" 51% ownership, with immediate operational control and plans for significant capital improvements. "But why? Why would you do that?" The question revealed that Jessica still didn't understand the connection between her behavior and my response. She saw my purchase of Pinewood as an inexplicable business decision rather than a direct consequence of her attempt to exclude me from our family traditions. "I've been looking for investment opportunities, and Pinewood presented an excellent chance to acquire a profitable business while preserving an institution that's been important to our community for decades." It was the truth, though not the complete truth. The business case for purchasing Pinewood was solid, but my timing had been motivated by more personal considerations. James Morrison cleared his throat diplomatically. "If you'll excuse me, I should return to overseeing the holiday service. Mr. Morrison, please let me know if there's anything you need for your guests." After James left, Jessica and I sat in silence while she struggled to process the implications of what she'd learned. The power dynamics of our relationship had shifted so fundamentally that she seemed unable to find stable ground for continuing our conversation. "So, when I made our reservation," Jessica said slowly, "when I requested the Lakeview room and the special menu arrangements, you were booking facilities at your father's establishment, yes. And when I asked you to help with catering costs, you were asking me to subsidize a celebration at my own restaurant where I wasn't welcome as a guest." The mathematical clarity of the situation was undeniable. Jessica had unknowingly created a scenario where every aspect of her Thanksgiving celebration depended on resources I controlled, while simultaneously excluding me from participating in the gathering those resources made possible. "I didn't know," Jessica said weakly. "Would it have mattered if you did?" The question forced her to confront the fundamental assumptions underlying her behavior. Would knowledge of my ownership have changed her decision to exclude me, or would it have simply modified her approach to securing continued access to the venue? Jessica's phone buzzed with a text message, and she glanced at the screen with obvious relief at the distraction. "Brad's wondering where I am. The kids are getting restless." The mention of Emma and Tyler reminded us both that this conversation had implications beyond our immediate relationship. Whatever resolution we reached would affect my grandchildren's understanding of family loyalty, respect, and consequences. "Jessica, I need you to understand something. This isn't about money or control or punishment. This is about basic human dignity. I never meant to hurt you, Dad. But you did hurt me. And more importantly, you've been hurting me for years while taking my support for granted." She looked up from her phone with tears that seemed more genuine than her earlier display. "I don't know how to fix this." The admission was the first honest statement she'd made since discovering me at Pinewood. For the first time in our conversation, Jessica seemed to be grappling with the reality of her behavior rather than defending or rationalizing it. "Start by acknowledging what you've done, not just today, but the pattern of treating me like a financial resource rather than a person you love." "I do love you, Dad." "I believe you do, But love isn't just a feeling, Jessica. It's also behavior. And your behavior toward me has been disrespectful and exploitative for far too long. Jessica wiped her eyes with a tissue from her purse, smearing her carefully applied makeup. What happens now? Are you going to kick us out of the restaurant? The question revealed that she still didn't fully grasp the situation. This wasn't about petty revenge or humiliation, despite how her actions might have warranted such responses. I'm not going to kick you out, Jessica. You're my daughter, and Emma and Tyler are my grandchildren. You're welcome to finish your meal and enjoy the rest of your evening. Relief washed over her face, followed quickly by confusion. Then I don't understand what you want from me. I want acknowledgement. I want apology. I want genuine change in how you treat me, and I want you to understand that my generosity is not unlimited if it isn't accompanied by basic respect. Jessica nodded slowly, though I couldn't tell whether her agreement was genuine or simply an attempt to de-escalate our confrontation. Can we talk about this more after the holidays, when emotions aren't running so high? We can talk whenever you're ready to have an honest conversation about our relationship. She stood up from her chair, straightening her dress and attempting to repair her appearance. I should get back to Brad and the kids. They're probably wondering what happened to me. Of course, enjoy the rest of your dinner. Jessica paused at the conference room door, her hand on the handle. Dad, are you going to tell people about this? About buying the club? The question revealed her continuing focus on managing appearances rather than addressing underlying issues. Jessica was worried about how her social circle would react to learning that she'd excluded her father from Thanksgiving dinner at his own establishment. The ownership change is a matter of public record, Jessica. I'm not going to broadcast personal family drama, but I'm also not going to hide my business investments to protect your social reputation. She nodded and left the conference room, her shoulders set with the kind of determined composure that suggested she was preparing to face Brad's questions and manage the children's confusion about the extended absence. I remained in the conference room for several minutes, looking out at Pinewood's golf course while processing what had just occurred. The confrontation had been less dramatic than I'd anticipated, but more emotionally complex. Jessica's tears and apparent remorse suggested some capacity for recognizing her mistakes, but her immediate concerns about appearances and social management indicated that deeper change would require time and sustained effort. When I returned to the main dining room, my friends looked up with expressions of concern and curiosity. They'd watched Jessica return to her table with obvious emotional distress, followed by animated whispered conversations with Brad that had attracted attention from nearby diners. How did it go? Harold asked as I took my seat. She knows I own Pinewood now. The rest remains to be seen. Dorothy leaned forward with barely contained excitement. What was her reaction when she found out? Shock, confusion, some tears, and immediate concern about how this affects her social standing.
Ruth Thompson shook her head with the weary disappointment of someone who'd spent decades watching young people struggle with accountability. Some lessons can only be learned through consequences, Frank. You've given her a clear demonstration of cause and effect. Through the archway, I could see Jessica's table engaged in what appeared to be damage control. Brad kept glancing toward our dining room with expressions that alternated between embarrassment and anger. Emma and Tyler seemed oblivious to the adult tensions, focused on their dessert plates and the promise of leftovers to take home. Maria Santos approached our table with the evening's final course, a selection of traditional pies that showcased her exceptional baking skills. Mr. Morrison, I hope everything has been satisfactory this evening. Everything has been perfect, Maria. Please extend my compliments to your entire kitchen staff. As Maria served dessert, I noticed movement from Jessica's table. Brad was standing now, his posture rigid with barely controlled anger. He spoke in hushed tones to Jessica while gesturing toward our dining room, his agitation becoming increasingly obvious despite his attempts at discretion. Emma tugged at her mother's sleeve, clearly sensing the tension but unable to understand its source. Jessica leaned down to whisper something to her daughter, then rose from her chair with the determined expression she wore when preparing for confrontation.
This time, Brad accompanied her as they approached our table. His face was flushed with embarrassment and indignation, the kind of righteous anger that came from feeling manipulated or deceived. "Frank, we need to talk," Brad announced without preamble, his voice carrying enough volume to attract attention from nearby diners. Harold Patterson immediately stood, his military bearing creating a subtle but unmistakable barrier between Brad and me. "Is there a problem here?" "Yeah, there's a problem," Brad replied, his voice rising further. "Frank bought this place just to manipulate our family dinner. This whole thing is sick and controlling." The accusation hung in the air like a toxic cloud. Several other diners had turned to watch our interaction, their holiday meals interrupted by the unfolding family drama. Dorothy Williams set down her fork with deliberate precision. "Young man, I think you need to reconsider your tone and your accusations. Don't lecture me about tone. This is harassment. Frank knew we were coming here tonight, knew this was important to Jessica, and bought the restaurant just to mess with us." Jim Martinez spoke with the calm authority that had served him well in business negotiations. "Actually, son, Frank has been considering restaurant investments for months. The timing had nothing to do with your dinner plans." "That's convenient. Just like it's convenient that he showed up here tonight with all his friends to spy on our family celebration." The distortion of facts was breathtaking. Brad had transformed my legitimate business investment and social plans into evidence of stalking and manipulation. He'd created a narrative where I was the villain in a situation that began with Jessica excluding me from our family tradition. Ruth Thompson's voice cut through the tension with the kind of quiet authority that had silenced rowdy classrooms for decades. "Mr. Chen, your wife disinvited her father from Thanksgiving dinner, then asked him to pay for your catering. Now you're angry that he made other social arrangements?" The logical contradiction was undeniable, but Brad seemed incapable of recognizing it. "That's not the point. The point is this manipulative game he's playing." "The only game being played here," Harold said firmly, "is by people who want financial support without offering respect in return." Jessica finally spoke, her voice strained with emotion. "Brad, please stop. This isn't helping anything." "I'm not going to let your father manipulate our family anymore, Jess. This has gone too far." The possessive language revealed everything about Brad's perspective. In his mind, I was an external threat to his family unit, rather than Jessica's father, who deserved basic consideration and inclusion. James Morrison appeared at the edge of our gathering, his professional composure intact despite the obvious tension. "Ladies and gentlemen, perhaps we could continue this conversation in a more private setting. Other guests are beginning to express concern about the disturbance." Brad turned his anger toward James. "Don't worry about it. We're leaving, and we won't be coming back to this place as long as Frank owns it." The threat was delivered with theatrical finality, as if denying me their patronage represented some kind of meaningful punishment. Brad seemed genuinely unaware that his boycott of my establishment might actually be a relief rather than a consequence. "That's your choice, Mr. Chen," James replied diplomatically. "We certainly hope you'll reconsider once emotions have settled." Jessica looked around the dining room, seeing the faces of people she'd known for years, witnessing her husband's public meltdown and her own family's dysfunction. The social embarrassment she'd been trying to avoid had materialized in the worst possible way. "Brad, we should go," she said quietly. "Emma and Tyler are getting upset." Indeed, both children were now crying softly, overwhelmed by the adult conflict they couldn't understand but knew involved their beloved grandfather. Emma kept looking toward our table with confusion and longing, clearly wanting to run to me but held back by the invisible barriers created by her parents' anger. "You're right," Brad said, his voice still carrying residual hostility. "Kids, get your coats. We're leaving." As they prepared to depart, Emma broke free from her parents and ran toward our table. "Grandpa Frank, why aren't you having dinner with us?" The innocence of the question cut through all the adult rationalizations and manipulations.
Emma didn't understand exclusions based on social preferences or relationship dynamics. She only knew that her grandfather, who'd always been present for family celebrations, was sitting across the room while she ate dinner. I knelt down to Emma's level, my heart breaking at the confusion in her 8-year-old eyes. Sometimes adults have disagreements, sweetheart, but that doesn't change how much I love you. Can you come sit with us now? There's room at our table. Before I could respond, Brad strode over and took Emma's hand firmly. Come on, honey, we're going home now. But I want Grandpa Frank to come with us, Emma protested, tears streaming down her face. That's not possible tonight, Brad said, pulling her away despite her resistance. Jessica watched this interaction with obvious distress, torn between supporting her husband's position and responding to her daughter's emotional needs. For a moment, she seemed on the verge of intervening, of recognizing that Brad's anger was causing unnecessary pain to the children. But the moment passed. Jessica gathered Tyler, who was crying quietly while clutching a dinner roll, and followed Brad toward the exit. The family left Pinewood in a cloud of tension and unresolved conflict, leaving behind a dining room full of witnesses to their dysfunction. After they departed, my friends rallied around me with the kind of support that comes from genuine relationships built on mutual care and respect. Dorothy reached over and squeezed my hand. Harold poured wine. Ruth offered quiet words of encouragement about standing up for my dignity. You did the right thing, Frank, Carol Martinez said softly. Those children deserve to see what self-respect looks like, even if their parents can't recognize it.
The evening concluded with the warmth and gratitude that Thanksgiving was meant to embody. We shared stories, laughed at Harold's military anecdotes, and celebrated the kind of authentic relationships that enriched life rather than draining it. As we prepared to leave, James Morrison approached with an envelope. Mr. Morrison, this was left at the friend desk for you. Inside was a brief note from Jessica, written in her familiar handwriting. Dad, I'm sorry about tonight. Brad is angry and saying things he doesn't mean. Can we talk tomorrow when everyone is calmed down? I want to fix this. Love, Jessica. I folded the note carefully and placed it in my jacket pocket. Whether Jessica's apology was genuine or simply another attempt at manipulation remained to be seen. But for the first time in years, I felt the peace that came from refusing to enable disrespectful behavior, regardless of the family relationships involved. Walking out of Pinewood that evening, surrounded by friends who'd valued me for who I was rather than what I could provide, I realized that I'd finally learned the difference between being used and being loved. The lesson had cost me a family dinner, but it had returned something far more valuable: my self-respect. Emma's tears haunted me, but I knew that teaching her about dignity and boundaries was ultimately more loving than demonstrating that disrespect had no consequences. Sometimes the most difficult gift we can give the people we love is the refusal to enable their worst impulses. The future of my relationship with Jessica remained uncertain, but my relationship with myself had never been clearer. I was no longer willing to purchase love with money or accept crumbs of affection in exchange for unlimited support. If Jessica wanted a real relationship with her father, she'd have to offer respect along with her requests. Standing in Pinewood's parking lot under the stars, surrounded by friends who'd witnessed my transformation from enabler to self-advocate, I felt truly grateful for the first time in years. Not grateful for what I could provide others, but grateful for what I'd finally learned to demand from myself: basic human dignity.
Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.